Thanks for doing it.
Okay. All right. Well, welcome everyone. We're going to be going over today housing and contemporary organizing. We're going to be analyzing two pieces in newspaper publications, the Oakland Side and the New York Times, that profile efforts that, we have a new person here, that go over efforts at tenant organizing in both the Bay Area and in Manhattan. But as I was discussing with Joan here, even though the N+1 article does not have anything really to do with housing organizing per se, I thought it much more accurately captured the daily grinds, the ins and outs, the highs and the lows, this, as I said, the sweetness of victory and the bitterness of defeat that comes with this kind of work better than any short newspaper profile could. And especially for anyone who is going to get involved with this work, I would recommend reading, again, even though it doesn't talk about housing, I would recommend reading the N+1 essay for sure to get a taste of it. But we'll try to get through this in short order if it's going to be a smaller group. And then if for anyone who's I guess watching or listening to this after the fact on YouTube, thank you very much for doing so. So we have three pieces that to me taken together weave the twin responsibilities of organizing, which is the external work and the internal work. I would say the two housing pieces deal with the external aspects of organizing, in this case, housing organizing, which is recognizing structural issues and injustices facing you or your community, identifying who is responsible for them, reaching out to others being affected to join you in collective action to address them, to make your demands, to win your demands, rinse and repeat in order to try to win bigger and bigger demands and transform your conditions together, which, as we were discussing, were it so easy, we would just do that all the time. We would just hit the organizing button and organizing would happen, and we would have a beautiful garden of organizing victories. Which is why I stress, if you can read the N+1 article, the N+1 essay, please do, because while this is necessary work, this is one of the hardest things you can commit to doing in your life. And I think that the N+1 article very beautifully captures the internal aspects of organizing, which is recognizing that organizing, whether it's housing, in elections, in labor, wherever your capacity, it's a major responsibility to ask people to join you in that cause. And if you commit to it, you're going to change the way you live your life, and you're going to ask many others to do the same with you, which is no small thing. There are going to be long stretches of quiet and monotony, punctuated by panic once the campaign is in motion and begins to escalate. And you will fail more often than you succeed, after which you will either find the resolve to continue pushing on through defeat in the hopes of future victories, or you won't. And the article lands on that outcome as well. So we'll go through the housing pieces again very quickly. So there was a renter in the Oakland Side, in the Bay Area. There was a renter named Christina who had formed a tenants union in 2019 with 10 of her neighbors a year before the pandemic over a fight on being overcharged by the landlord for heating, and their fight was successful. And then a year later, at the onset of COVID, their attention turned to preventing evictions in the event of an economic downturn. So they already had the structure of a tenant union in place a year before COVID had happened, which allowed them to more easily and more quickly coordinate what their response was going to be during the wave of evictions that happened during the pandemic. In the beginning, only 8 of the Alice Street Apartments 38 unit residents were willing to consider a rent strike. However, residents at Ivy Hill complex, which was also owned by the same landlord, had posted a notice that they had successfully formed a new tenants union themselves and had won demands from that landlord by pursuing a rent strike. So the two groups merged into the Ivy Hill Alice tenant union. Over the next year, they withheld $650,000 in rent. They organized collective voicemail campaigns where they would gather in groups to leave messages with management outlining their complaints. They would have public demonstrations to build community support among their neighbors who were not necessarily living in those buildings, but were in the vicinity and might care to lend their support to their cause. They came to an agreement with management after long negotiations and raising the profile of their campaign, where they would receive a 30% reduction in all back rent owed and an additional 10% rent reduction from April through December 2020. So that was the Oakland side piece. Again, just going through the bullet points of what the issues they were facing were and how they mobilized their response and how they were able to win. The New York Times piece is slightly different. The villain in this story is not any one specific landlord. It's the city agency NYCHA, so New York City Housing Authority, where people were having a lot of complaints with conditions in their public housing apartments and being routinely ignored and sometimes rudely ignored. So Lakeisha Taylor is the focus of this piece. She was living in NYCHA housing on the Upper East Side. Would wake up concerned that she would not have the basics of decent housing, including lack of hot water. She'd be dealing with scaldingly hot radiators. The kids would get nosebleeds from poor air quality. They'd have non-functioning elevators that lead to 54 walks downstairs. There'd be rodents and bugs, etc. She'd write to NYCHA with her complaints to make sure that she had a record of those complaints and would be routinely ignored. And she suspects that she was labeled as being a burden within the system because she would so frequently reach out asking for help. And then when ignored, would continue to make calls again and again and again. So eventually she formed the Isaac's Homes Coalition with residents of a neighboring NYCHA development. They launched a similar outreach effort as the people in Oakland did. The difference being the target of the efforts was a state agency rather than an exploitative landlord. They canvassed, they held meetings with neighbors outlining their rights to regular heat and hot water, to have safe elevators, to not have to deal with rodents, that the building should be in good, healthy quality, etc. They filed a collective lawsuit against NYCHA in 2019. And ever since the coalition took NYCHA to court, some of the conditions did improve, those being the elevators breaking down less often, but she outlined that many other issues persist, including the bugs and the rodents and the heating. So they were able to win some demands, but not all, just by pursuing a collective lawsuit. So we have two articles here outlining tenants recognizing that things in their building were not right. The landlord, or in this case, the agency was responsible for addressing them, was not addressing them. And rather than accept that this is the way things were going to be, they banded together in a pursuit of collective action to resolve those issues and try to win better conditions. Again, were it so simple. That was my issue with reading these pieces in the Times and the Oakland side is, again, I've been doing this since 2019. And if it was this simple, everybody would do it. So we're going to move on to the N+1 article, which goes through why doing this work is extremely, extremely difficult.
Just one question.
Sure.
You referred to the agency as a state agency.
Sorry, city agency.
City.
I'm sorry,
Oh,
city agency, New York City Housing Authority. I'm sorry, state. I meant state, the concept of the state, not New York State.
Okay.
Yeah, a government agency. Yeah.
It's the government.
Yes, the city government, but not the state government. Yes.
Right.
Okay. So as the N+1 essay shows, if a movement is going to be successful long-term, you're not just going to end up asking people to come to a rally or sign a petition or leave a voicemail. You're going to be inviting new people to become organizers themselves in order to carry out the work of the larger project, which functionally means asking them to change the way they live their lives until the demands are won. So the author, Alyssa Battistani, interned at a community organizing nonprofit in DC. She had gone to Occupy and went to various protests during college and afterwards She wrote, she understood the language of organizing as an abstract concept from doing this, but it wasn't until she got to Yale as a grad student and joined a still unrecognized grad student union and worked to try to win recognition for the union that she understood class struggle concretely. She wanted something and she needed other people to want it too. And she had to count on them to want it in their actions and the work that they carried out, just as she was doing. Now, she has a quote here that I think is very good to reflect on. Organizing, in other words, is unembarrassed about power. It recognizes that to wield it, you need to persuade untold numbers of people to join a cause and to begin organizing themselves. Organizing means being in it to win. In other words, a lot of politics is not so much trying to say, you have one set of ideas in your head, and I'd like you to have another set of ideas in your head. The harder task is finding someone who already agrees with you and then asking them to join you in turning those beliefs and convictions into political action. That is a very tall order and a much harder ask, because you're asking people not just to change their mind, you're asking them to change their daily schedule, and you're asking them to do it until you win. And who knows when that will be.
If ever.
So how to win? As the article explains, historical materialism holds that crises of capitalism can spark revolts. But how can you explain people living in unjust systems carrying on with their lives every day anyway? That's something I think that would be recognizable to everyone here in the United States. And they explained Gramsci held that people will accept living in a dominant but unjust social order if acquiescing to its logic comes across as common sense. This is the concept of hegemony. She gives an example on becoming a Thatcherite subject when she was in London. They would rally against Thatcher on Saturday afternoon, but only after shopping at Sainsbury's on Saturday morning. In other words, they understood what was attractive about the Thatcherite project, even if they were obviously opposed to the political project, but they could see in their own lives the appeal of what Thatcher was trying to advance, if it meant them getting to go, shopping for nice things, basically. So she went to grad school at Yale to study political theory and better grasp the issues she was facing, joined the Grad Students Union, and again, was supportive in the abstract. But when they asked her, could you join the comms team, she broke into tears because she was already buried in work. And the thought of taking on another responsibility, even one small thing, was too much. And that, just being asked to take on a role or a responsibility to her was too much. So she took on less demanding work instead, but agreed she would stay in the organization and try to take on more work later on down the road. The reason why she invested herself in the union more and more was not anything that changed in her personal life, but that the union became a space where she could make sense and meaning of the injustices she was facing and talk about them, which she was finding she could not do socially with her friends, as talking about a bleak job market, exploitative work conditions, the commodification of the self to win academic credentials. Those things don't make for polite conversation when you're out at the bar with your friends, but they are perfect for shop talk in a union meeting or at a union social. And she started spending more and more time at the union because the issues that she was facing were the same as the ones being faced by the other union members. And she built stronger relationships with the union comrades just from din of feeling like they could relate to her and felt the same conviction about wanting to do something about it, if for no other reason that future generations wouldn't have to deal with those issues. So again, as she got more involved with union organizing, she found that her biggest task was not convincing people that the union was good in the abstract, but that they should dedicate their own time to making it a success. For background information, it had been 30 years since the effort to launch an officially recognized Yale Grad Students Union began, and she was going to be part of the effort to finally, after 30 years, win official recognition for the union. So it wasn't a matter of moving ideological opponents into ideological supporters, but turning those supporters into active members who would carry out the responsibilities and tasks to try to popularize and agitate for winning union recognition. Many were willing to go to a rally, sign a petition or a union card, but did not want to go to meetings or join a team. They liked living their own lives in peace. To go back to the early example, they just wanted to go to Sainsbury's on Saturday morning, and they'd be fine skipping the rally on Saturday afternoon. So she found she was demoralized by this until she came across some quotes from SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. They were trying to organize Black Mississippians to agitate for the end of Jim Crow and get real material voting rights to be the law of the land, and found that the reasons why Black residents in Mississippi wouldn't want to participate were ones that she was finding on the Yale campus. Quote, "They're just not interested, don't have time to discuss voting right now, but maybe come back later. Feel that politicians are going to do whatever they want anyway, so why should I bother? I'm too busy, I'm too engaged in personal affairs. I'd like some time to think it over, that time being forever." Or just some people saying, "I'm just satisfied with things as they are and don't feel the need to get involved." So either their expectation was things are never going to change, or whether things change, it won't be because I participated, it'll be because someone else did, someone other than me. Still quoting, "We were all too busy, but the too busyness wasn't really about time, or at least not only. Being too busy meant people didn't see why the union was worth making time for. Your job as an organizer was to find out about what it was that people wanted to be different in their lives, and then not to persuade people that it mattered whether they wanted it, but whether they decided to do something about it. This is not the same thing as persuading people that the thing in itself matters. They usually know it does. The task is to persuade people that they matter. They usually know they don't." Which I thought was a very good point to land on. I won't go through the whole union campaign because it takes up a good third of the article and it's a long essay. But the union had connected her demands, which were real, if not world historical, to the long history of labor struggles, contemporary efforts to rebuild worker power, visions of a different future that they could all play a role in bringing about. So through tireless work, constant outreach, one-on-ones, public demonstrations, the Yale Grad Students Union finally won their official recognition and submitted with the NLRB. This was around the time of Trump's inauguration, January 2017, and they were trying to get the election held with the NLRB before Trump could make his appointments. That did not happen. Yale stonewalled the grad students on a contract and basically held out that union activity would die down if they did so. And then the Trump appointees to the NLRB basically junked their submission for union recognition. So the grad students union declining prospect eroded the union's momentum and faith in leadership. Things fell apart. Alyssa moved to New York. She awaited her next invitation to an organizing meeting, but one never came. So in housing organizing, or in any organizing, you're not just trying to transform your neighbors' living conditions or how much rent they pay. You're also working to transform your neighbor, how they relate to themselves as a working class subject, and how they relate to the other people they live among. You are trying to reach alienated neoliberal subjects and transform them into agents of a working class political constituency, which means asking them to change not just how they are living in their buildings, but how they are living in each day of their lives, how they steel themselves against defeats and build towards future victories. And with that, I will yield to anyone who has comments, questions, concerns, etc.
The point about the NLRB,
Mhm.
can you win a union
They were trying to win a contract after having won the union, similar to what Schultz is doing with the Starbucks unions. They officially win their union, but then comes time to negotiate a contract. Yale basically stonewalled them on a contract until the union eventually dissolved because people were getting demoralized.
But what role, if any, does the NLRB play in a situation like that?
I believe it's either approving or moving along the process of union recognition, was my understanding from the article.
Okay, I think that bears coming back to,
Okay.
and sometime in the future
Sure.
where we do a
Sure.
20-minute or a half-hour session on just what the role of the NLRB is.
Athena, you're on stack.
No, I was just relating to what Martin said. Is it that a certain percentage of people in the workplace have to agree to the union so that you can win the union?
It had to be department by department. I think they won by large margins in all departments except one. And as I understand it, the one department that voted against, it was not a big, margin. So they had the votes for forming the union, but then it was coming down to what the union contract was going to be and to whom it would be extended. And Yale was basically trying to kill them with time as much as they could. And it seems like they were successful in that throughout 2017 into 2018. Joan, you're on stack.
Yeah, just also in follow up to that, I was struck by the same, the same pattern of winning the recognition for the union. And then, are they not required to negotiate with you? Or do they kind of pretend to negotiate with you and they don't really? I'm not sure how that works either, but I agree that it's worth coming back to.
Sure.
But I was also struck by, and Jared, if you have the possibility of copying and pasting that New York Times article, maybe
Sure.
in Slack, I would definitely like to read it, because the more I thought about it, and particularly the contrast between Oakland and the New York City examples. I mean, Oakland, at least if I understood it correctly, this was happening early on in the pandemic.
Mhm.
So in a weird way, they had some serious advantages of
Mhm.
some sudden changes, right?
Yeah.
The sudden changes that look like a crisis and act like a crisis and actually get some sympathy from the outside and overcome some of the stigma of not paying your rent,
Which the article goes into, about
Yeah.
overcoming the shame. Because for me, it's like that's a tactic. That's something you would do to try to win concessions for everyday people. It's I'm not paying my rent. I'm embarrassed that I'm not paying my rent. I'm supposed to pay rent for my apartment.
Exactly. So it in some weird ways, it's a lot easier to get people behind the rent strike in that circumstance than if you were just dealing with the day-to-day issues of capitalism. And they were able to put on enough pressure with the rent strike to actually get concessions. And I'm sure you guys hear as much as I do about the horrendous months-long and sometimes years-long deficiencies in large buildings in New York City. And I think it's both NYCHA and private owners that are in charge of these buildings, and they get away with it for years on end. So I'm really interested in how anybody successfully puts on any pressure in New York City.
So if you want, I'll copy and paste the text of the article. I'll put it on a Word doc, and I'll put it in the PolyEd Slack channel, so you have it.
Great, thank you.
Athena and then Martin.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of crises is kind of interesting. Capitalism seems to supply crises at regular intervals.
Yeah.
If capitalism wasn't like an ongoing crisis, we probably wouldn't be that bothered about trying to, I mean, we had the financial crisis, and then a lot of the housing crisis that we have now was due to the fact that investors took advantage of that to buy up a lot of the rental housing and strip, many homeowners lost their chance at home ownership forever. And, you know, and that's an ongoing crisis now with 260,000 people with evictions hanging over them in New York State. So it's true in a way that that crisis can give opportunities, but at the same time, I remember, you know, living in the UK when a lot of things were nationalized and the electricity workers still went on strike and we had blackouts, because sometimes the more, I mean, they were organized, and the more power people have, sometimes the more they demand. You know what I mean? Sometimes you see people who are very oppressed and you say that, like, why aren't they revolting? They're so oppressed. They almost have nothing to lose, but it doesn't quite work that way, like you point out. And the reality is, you know, it works both ways. The more people are oppressed, the more precious that little bit of time that they have for their personal life. You know, if they're working really long hours, if they have really horrible, nasty conditions at work and problems having to fix things at home, then that little bit of time that you have is so precious. You know, that somebody coming along and asking you to give that away, you have to believe that you can win. And plus, you have to trust that person. I think you sort of presented that responsibility really well, but also it did make an impression on me, the article about the Oakland organizing, the woman of color who said that, you know, I needed to make sure that these people were organized because I was afraid that they were going to lead me into something where I would lose everything, but they would have something to fall back on, and I wouldn't.
For anyone listening on YouTube, there was an organizer who saw that a lot of the other residents were white, and her concern was, oh, well, they probably have a relative who's a doctor or some professional who they can fall back on. I definitely don't have that, and so if I'm going to organize with these people, I need them to be as serious as I'm going to be about it, because I'm fighting for my life.
Yeah, and she said that she found that they were truly organized. So that means being organized, being professional, you don't go into something and ask people to risk things without knowing what you're talking about, and having the commitment to follow through as well, of course. But also just, a lot of it is really mundane stuff. And the thing of rambling on, like some of my heroes, because I'm, well, anyway, it doesn't matter. Well, like Pablo Neruda and like Yanis Ritsos, poets, revolutionary poets. And I start to wonder, how much time did they spend like writing emails, messages?
Sure.
How much time did they spend like going door to door? I guess poets get like a special dispensation not to do as much of that. I think they did go through some horrible stuff as well, prison and all kinds of stuff. But I sort of, a lot of the stuff is not romantic. It's mundane. It's hard. And when people are working full time, I give a lot of credit to the younger people here who are working full time. And then on top of that, that you're sort of working at the edge of what you can possibly do, because you're working full time, trying to survive capitalism, and yet you're adding more hours of mundane, boring, difficult work to sort of do something against capitalism. And I think we have to give ourselves credit, especially when we're bad-tempered. or whatever reason, when we get annoyed with each other, I sort of like, I think, I feel we have to think about the fact that people are working at the edge of what they can possibly do and taking on way too much a lot of the time.
Martin, you're on Stack.
Yeah, going back to the very basic issues on housing. There's private housing, there's government-owned housing. There's another category, which is cooperative housing. Stuyvesant Village in Manhattan has been going, I think it's still co-op, for decades, for 50, 60, 70 years, something like that. It was built I think in the 20s or something like that. Anyway, the point I'm coming to is it would be very interesting to compare what they spend on maintenance compared to government housing and private landlord housing. Private landlord, the information for private landlord housing is probably private, obviously, but maybe somehow you can get, we could get our hands on it. The government numbers should be public record, and the co-op might be willing to share the numbers and see, you know, is it a lack of spending, or is it maybe something else? Okay, but if it's a lack of spending, it would show up and make very interesting you know, information to pass forward to people, to say that the private landlords are pocketing the money, they don't spend what they need in order to do proper maintenance, and the government is it is skimming, if you not skimming, you know, shaving the budget.
Yeah.
Okay, in order to please their bosses and not doing the proper spending. This is what it costs to properly maintain a building in good order.
Mm.
All right, Jeremy, I think you're the only one who hasn't spoken. Do you have any comments, questions, concerns, thoughts, etc.?
Just maybe not so much that we haven't said already, I guess, other than yeah, I think understanding the kind of seriousness of the responsibility, I think, is going to be important for us as like we push through with the ATU in Yonkers.
Yeah,
because yeah, I think anyone who hasn't like been here, like it's like an extremely segregated city, like an I would say extremely politically demotivated, like just comparing my experience to say like New York City and other major cities, like for how big and how, I guess, important the need is. It's like very, I don't know, politically, there's a lack of political organization here. So just the fact that like almost on a whim we were able to get like what is it, over 30 people to come to Know Your Rights workshop because they were desperate, I think kind of speaks to the seriousness of what we're doing.
for me, and again, we brought it up during the debrief, not only that they came, but that they stayed to talk and make friends with each other after. Like the hum in that room, that was everything that told me that there's something here in Yonkers to be done on the housing terrain, that people could have just filed out and shuffled out, grabbed their bag and said, okay, that was that. Now I'm going, I guess in this case, to Sainsbury's or whatever the equivalent would be. But no, they stayed and they said, all right, well, now having listened to the presentation, I'm going to go talk to the other people who live here in Yonkers with me about what they're doing, what they're facing, any ideas they might have, and comparing notes, comparing strategies, etc. So no, I could tell from the hum in the room that there's something in Yonkers on the housing terrain.
Nice.
All right, anything else? I mean, we don't have to keep going for the sake of continuing, but Athena, you're on step. Well, Martin, you spoke up, so I'll do Martin and then Athena.
Well, Athena, go ahead.
Okay,
You
Athena,
first.
then Martin.
And then I just have a closing thought.
Okay.
I could go on talking for ages.
All right. Well, people, this is going to get
I mean, I
uploaded
think
to
it's interesting.
YouTube.
We
and
had a
that's bad news for us. we need to.
You want to go?
We're not-
It's okay. I'm just saying that. I'm saying that as a compliment. The articles were interesting. The presentation was very good. We may not. I mean, I think you brought out a lot of the points really well. So it's not like we need to go on talking for ages.
Sure.
It's just that it was interesting, and I thought it was interesting that one of the tenants, actually the same tenant that I mentioned before, she believed the kind of mythology about landlords, that this was a small landlord, and that was interesting. It kind of linked to that whole Gramsci thing, where it's not just you know, I mean, yeah, you know, people who are even in that situation, she was doing her own repairs because she believed that the landlord was stretched and that he was, you know, a nice guy and like an individual landlord that just had one building. And then she found out that he owns 30 buildings and he's
Yeah.
obviously raking in huge profits. And that just shows how, you know, knowing things like that, that kind of information can be so powerful because
Yeah.
it completely changes, you know, it completely upends those kind of myths, you know, those kind of myths, because again, you know, like when we had that Dana Levenberg meeting, she was coming out with these things about small landlords complaining, you know, and this is the image that people have. The reality is that, you know, most of the landlords are corporate landlords. They have, you know, they own many buildings. They are, you know, and they're the ones who are causing most of the problems. And again, it's a concentration of wealth in like a small number of people. It's not like some poor, you know, elderly lady who happens to own like an, you know, or rents part of her house or whatever. It's not like that at all. So yeah, that information is. And as far as organizing in New York State, you know, I'm sorry, this Marjorie Taylor Greene, if it ever comes about that the states do come apart, because I've kind of fantasized about that a little bit.
I'll be honest.
New York State is going to be the socialist state. I'm sorry. We already have, we have the wealth to, and, you know, honestly, I mean, like, if the wealth was evenly distributed, even across the US, every single person would, how much was it? 200.
It was 315,000, if I remember from Corey's presentation, something like that.
Man, woman, and child, and, you know, actually, I shouldn't be falling back on those kind of categories, but, you know, every person would have that. But apart from that, New York is a lot richer than the average state. But apart from that, we have socialists in office in New York State. And we're winning stuff, even in the housing, you know, we are winning stuff. And I think people need to know that, you know. And I also feel like, I mean, I don't know, Jeremy's really worried about us fighting just for laws. And I don't think that we should do that. I agree with him. But it's like, I feel like, you know, like Jerry said, you know, when you do tenant organizing, you change people.
Yes.
You know, but when you change laws, you change society as well. But you need to change people to change society, because those people are not going to stand up for themselves unless they learn to organize or whatever, whether it's through the tenant union, through a different kind of union or whatever, you know. So I think both the things are important.
Sure.
But the reality is that a socialist state is going to be a state with laws that make it fair, you know, we're not quite at the withering away of the state, okay? It's going to be a state with laws that make it impossible or make it, you know, progressively more and more difficult for some people to exploit other people or to accumulate vast amounts of wealth. So changing the law is part of that process, changing laws and creating a body of like fairer and fairer laws, but also changing people and showing them that they can win. Sorry, I'm really like a little bit.
We're gonna go to Martin and then Joan is on stage.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's why I think, you know, we have to believe that we can change laws, but we have to do both, because if the laws don't change, you can get another Hitler. You know,
I mean, I'm sure there is a Battistoni level article on how difficult it is to change even one law. I'm sure there's an article in there for us to review. None of these things that we're talking about are easy, but they are all worth doing. Martin and then Joan.
Okay, a few thoughts. We talked about measures that we could take to get better housing, and I think it's important to think about co-ops, where you're not arguing with a landlord, you own it together with other people who are your fellow residents. You can talk to the board, you can run for the board and be on it, okay? And it gets slighted, but you know, certainly for what we now call rental housing, which is to say, a serious alternative would be mass co-op housing. That's item number one. Item number two is we mentioned about a person who was sympathetic to the landlord, or at least tolerant of the landlord, until they found out that the landlord owned 30 buildings. Okay. One way to go about nailing who owns what is a geographic information system, which is a specialized piece of software. If you think, you might think of it as computerized mapping. So the houses would show up on a street on a map, part of the content of the map, and you could trace ownership by just asking the map, querying the map. Okay. If we're going to be in housing for the long run, it would be useful to have that kind of capability in-house. I'm not saying we have to start from scratch, but at least some people in the chapter who know how to use that kind of software to ask those kinds of questions. Okay. And then the third item I wanted to close with is going back to the Jacobin article about the Teamsters and their facing off against United Parcel. One of the things that's in the article as a byproduct, really, not the main topic, okay, but as a byproduct, again, is this business of people with full-time permanent jobs who have the work conditions of precarity. They sneak precarious work conditions into full-time permanent jobs. And that's what we saw with the railroad workers. Okay. And I'm beginning to think that this is widespread. Okay. That this stuff is around. And what I think we should do, number one, is just ask people, where you work, do you face that situation? Precarious work conditions that are usually associated with part-time temporary work, okay, but in a full-time permanent job, and just sort of log what people tell us. And then number two would be a white paper or a pamphlet saying how to spot this, what it means for you, and how to fight it, that we could put in people's hands, because it's a really important issue. Now, if it's the railroad workers and it's UPS drivers and warehouse people, you're starting to talk about really, really significant numbers of people.
Joan, you're on stack.
Yeah, well, that was interesting also. But I was originally kind of responding to something that Athena had said, and it reminded me of something I had heard, and I think it actually came out of the YouTube from the Getting Past the Binary, the NIMBY and YIMBY that had been posted that turned out to be really good. But it kind of interested me. And of course, what Martin just said about the potential of co-ops being real co-ops, there's a lot of potential out there in that way. But also it reminded me of something that was said in that meeting about New Yorkers. Sometimes New Yorkers as tenants, as renters, have a proprietary attitude, which is probably not common anywhere else in the country. And someone mentioned in that meeting, someone saying, oh, I'm going to be staying here until I die. And people feel that they belong, they have the right to stay in certain places. And of course, that gets fought all the time. But I think it is one of the things that gives New York City and maybe other places in New York State some power in terms of tenant organizing and feeling like you can win some fights, even though it's a constant struggle against a very rich and powerful lobby. Over.
Very good. All right, so I will make sure then to check out the NIMBY YIMBY video. I had a very busy week at work, so I have a thing from 10 to 11, and then maybe at midnight I will fall asleep to the NIMBY YIMBY video, which you should. Anyone listening to this, you should do the same. Jeremy, you are on Stack, and then Athena, you'll close out on TOPA and Social Housing Authority.
Yeah, just kind of wanted to follow up on that because I think that is like a real, like, in a lot of the country, like under capitalism, I think that is like a real contradiction to navigate, like kind of like how there's the whole there's a lot of people think they're a temporarily embarrassed millionaire, like
Yeah.
on the housing front, I take it a lot of people think they're a temporarily they're temporarily not homeowner or whatever like homeowner.
I'm renting for now.
Yeah, like homeowner.
I think if you're over 40, that's probably true. I think if you're under 40, maybe under 35, I know a lot of people my generation, they're just like, I will never retire, I will never stop renting, and it's not because that's what I want, it's because that's all I can see.
But people over 50, it's too late.
That's
if
true.
if you're getting close to retirement, and some of those tenant organizers, I mean, at least a couple of them were over 50.
That's true.
So,
all right, Athena, you want to close out on TOPA and Social Housing Authority?
yeah, I just thought Martin would be interested in TOPA, the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, because I'm really impressed. I sometimes feel I haven't presented the Housing Justice for All, the kind of I haven't been able to present it as impressive as the way I experience it. But they have developed legislation, and the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act is one of those that will allow tenants to collectively buy buildings, and there would be things in there that would prevent them from then cashing in by selling like much more expensive or anything like that. But the reality is that and people, lots of people are like, well, if you're having problems renting, how can you afford to buy? But the reality is that landlords are squeezing so much out of tenants that they're actually squeezing more out of them than they would be doing if you're paying rent, you will often be paying the value of your home in it could be either 10 years, which is a low one, or it could be like 3 years or 4 years. In 4 years, especially on the low income level, you could be paying the value of the place you live in rent in 4 years, because that's how high rents are in comparison to the cost of buying those buildings. The problem is that most tenants don't have access to getting a deposit, to getting financing and stuff like that. And that's where the difficulty will be. There'll need to be support in getting financing and getting, and all that. but it is absolutely a fantastic, you know, bill, because when the way landlords kind of control tenants is by just selling the building, then the building can be cleared out. They can go and buy something else or whatever, you know. So like Starbucks just closes some of their, you know, if they have unionization, they just go and close that store. That's what landlords do. They just sell the building and then they can clean everybody out and whatever. So
there's also tax implications. If you if you buy a building, I believe you get to take what they call accelerated depreciation. And then at the end of, I think it's a 7-year period, you sell it, purchase another one that's very similar to it, and do it all over again. It's a tax dodge.
Really? Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't know, but yeah, I mean, that's, yeah. So it's, so basically TOPA would allow tenants, it would give them time. It has a lot of, you know, they have to be informed that the building's going to be sold. It gives them time, it gives them the support and stuff like that. So the way that, you know, housing, and then the other thing that Housing Justice for All is doing, they sent 50 people to Vienna to research social housing. It wasn't just, they didn't send 50 privileged, like non-profits, whatever, like people. They sent tenant organizers. They sent tenant organizers who, you know, grassroots tenant organizers to research housing in Vienna, and they came back and they are producing legislation and a roadmap for a social housing authority, for social housing that is not demeaning, that is not, you know, and a vision for a different future in housing. And it may take 20 years or I don't know what, but you know what? They're creating, it's like they're creating a blueprint for the future, and you need that. You need to be able to imagine that. You need to be able to say, there's legislation for that. Go and call your fucking, you know, like, call your state assembly person.
We're gonna have to put
call
an
the
age
state
restriction on
assembly
this
person.
video.
I hate myself.
Whoa.
Well, I already talked to them, but you know, we have to, it's so difficult to get people to bug their state assembly people, their state senators. Call them. Let's bug them and bug them and bug them. And you know, they are actually, that Chris Burdick actually signed on to Right to Counsel again. And yeah, we have to keep bugging them anyway, but the roadmap is there.
To put a bow on it, and then we'll close out with the Battistoni article. If the strength of a movement is not just how it gets to victory, but how it deals with defeats, I think it speaks very well for the Housing Justice for All Coalition that they did not respond to last year's defeats by watering down their demands, but redoubling their demands and redoubling their organizing efforts, and starting sooner this year and starting more aggressively, and trying to broaden the horizon rather than, you know, try to appeal to, well, what version of this could you maybe support or whatever. I think trying to be as aggressive as possible in Albany, and get some fraction of what it is you're pushing for in the short term while building towards the long term. That to me, I think speaks very well for the horizon of housing organizing and agitation in Albany. So to that end, if you're a member of this chapter and you're listening to this video, Thursdays, 6:30, we do phone banking. I will be at the next one. I think you should be at the next one too, calling people who we need to flip to support this legislation. And you should also join our housing working group.
Did they have it this week? Because I couldn't find any information about it.
I couldn't either. So I'll bug someone and I'll figure out for next week.
But but we're going to have our own one for Dana Levenberg, and we can, you know, you can randomly call your own legislators at any time. It's just very hard to do that. Nobody does that.
And it's always better in a group. Martin, you're on second, and then we are going to close out.
Just very fast. When the people come back from Vienna, let's invite them to address us and describe.
They went at the end of last year.
Oh, then let's invite them and
All right.
you know, to address us and tell us what they found. It would make a great topic for a monthly meeting.
Athena, correct me if I'm wrong, I think there was an article in The Nation that you posted. What is it, where they wrote about the experience and what they found on their trip? Was it The Nation or was it a different publication?
There wasn't the Nation article. It was pretty short. I think there's also a video where they came and reported back to the Housing Justice Coalition, and I missed that. But I think, you know, there's going to be more, because it's not just they reported back, but then they have like a group that is working on the legislation that is really digging into, and they're actually going to put out a survey for tenants about their dealings with the social housing authority that exists, and what is wrong with it, like what could be much better and stuff like that, which I think, so there's ongoing things. But I will look. They said that they would send us links to that video, but there's always like a lot of things in the emails, so I didn't really notice, but I'll have a look for that and try to post it, because they did do that report. They did do a report back.
Yeah, I see it. I just clicked on it. That's it.
All right. Thank you, everyone. I'm gonna hit stop. And we're done recording.